Hello, this is Dan here. I've been an executive functions coach for almost 10 years now, and today we're going to be talking about one of the 8 executive function skills, inhibition. This is the second part of my intro series, so please note that I won't be able to talk about all of my experiences or give a crazy amount of examples. So if you have any examples that you want me to run through, go ahead and leave it in the comment section down below. If you like what we talk about, like and subscribe. Me and my team appreciates all the support you guys give us. Let's go ahead and jump into it. So what are we going to be covering today? Well, we're going to be going over the definition of inhibition. We're going to be talking about the perception of inhibition to those that don't have inhibition challenges. We're going to be talking about the perspective of the individuals that have inhibition challenges. And then we're going to go ahead and run through an example and a strategy that I commonly use for the clients that I work with that have inhibition challenges. And if you're somebody out there that is supporting somebody with inhibition challenges, the last part is I'm going to go ahead and give you all some help on how you can better support your individual with inhibition challenges. At the very end, I will also kind of give you guys my hot take on the 10 years that I've worked as an EF coach relating to helping individuals with inhibition. Hope you guys enjoy. Let's get to it. So what is inhibition? It was well defined in a meta-analysis published in 2021 by Contreras-Osorio and colleagues. And they say inhibition relates to attention and behavior and prevents our acting under control of your relevant environmental stimuli. Now, I think it's important to really emphasize on what your relevant environmental stimuli could be. Now, it could be classified in 2 different categories. One would be a physical, and the other one would be an emotional distraction. Now, an example of a physical distraction can range anywhere between your parents cooking in the kitchen or your dogs really wanting to play with you. Now, when one of my clients is looking for a reason to not work on their math assignment as an example, or their presentation for work, these physical distractions provide them the perfect outlet to lose track of time. Now, the second of which would be an emotional distraction. These distractions can be as specific as challenges with a relationship to something as broad as just having anxiety in general. And yes, I understand that we are not robots. You know, we can naturally get distracted and that's probably going to be okay. However, when we're talking about poor inhibition, this is when these irrelevant stimuli are chronic and dramatically affect the day-to-day activities of our lives. And I want to emphasize on chronic and dramatic. So let's go ahead and talk about it. So let's go ahead and illustrate the idea of chronic and dramatic or drastic when it comes to our inhibition or lack of inhibition skills. And let's go ahead and illustrate this through 2 examples. The first example is going to be the example of our dog wanting our attention. And the second example would be us struggling in a relationship or with somebody around us, etc. Now, our dog wanting our attention is a very common example, and you could probably replace dog with kids, friends, family members, etc., and it will still work. The typical response would be to pick up a toy and toss it across the room, play with the dog for a few minutes, or you would tell somebody, hey, mom, can you go ahead and take the dog out for a walk so it's not distracting me, or can you take it into a different room, etc. And there's generally some planning involved in there where you say, hey, I'm going to get a certain amount of work done, and then after I get that work done, I'm going to then get the reward of playing with my dog. So the once distraction, if somebody has good inhibition skills, the once distraction becomes translated into a reward. So that's generally, somebody that has, good inhibition skills will display that kind of behavior. However, somebody that has a lack of inhibition skills might end up playing with the dog or planning to play with the dog for, hey, let's just do like 5 to 10 minutes. It'll be a good break, etc. But then that plan of 5 to 10 minutes turns into hours and losing track of time and not getting the work done, etc. Or it will turn into, yelling at the dog, getting really mad at everybody around you, etc. And this is like in the example that really illustrates how it can become very drastic. A lack of inhibition can become very drastic. And then if you can imagine this happening constantly in different types of scenarios, and it becomes very chronic as well. So that's kind of the idea, at least with a physical distraction, how physical distractions, when it becomes very chronic, happening with different scenarios every single day, and becomes very drastic because the responses to the distractions are very drastic and dramatic. So let's go ahead and look at an example of having an emotional distraction because we are having conflicting agreements with those close to us or someone that we love. Now, the typical response in this scenario would be to process your feelings for an hour or two, either through journaling, exercise, going for a walk, or just removing yourself from the situation. Now, this takes a lot of emotional control, which is an executive function skill that we will talk about in a subsequent video later on and stuff. However, once we have processed a feeling, it is no longer stopping us from doing our work. The inhibition skill here is recognizing the time and place to process our emotions so that it doesn't drastically or chronically affect our day-to-day life. However, individuals that struggle with the emotional control and inhibition tend to allow their emotions to chronically affect their behavior and their attention. This means that the emotional distraction can lead to an unproductive day that can then cascade on into an unproductive week, then possibly an unproductive month, couple months, a year, couple years, a decade, a century, etc. You kind of get my point, right? Is that potentially one emotional distraction, if it's drastic enough and there's not a good inhibition skill set with the individual with that challenge, that emotional distraction could cause them way more harm than the previous physical distraction. Because emotions are strong and hard to process in general for us and also for individuals that have executive functions challenges, I often see my clients develop a fair amount of anxiety and depression that resulted from one emotional stimuli that distracted them from the work that they value very much. And I think that is the key about some of the inhibition challenges that we'll talk about when it comes to the perception of the individual. But let's go ahead and talk about how inhibition is perceived through the outside world. So how does the world perceive individuals with inhibition challenges that affect their behavior and their attention? Well, oftentimes when parents or spouses or teachers call me about an individual that is struggling with inhibition and a whole host of other executive function challenges, they often describe them as being spacey, unreliable, and destructive. Now, they're spacey because physical and emotional distractions, like we previously talked about, easily catch their attention, and without good inhibition skills, they succumb to these distractions, making it very hard to complete a conversation and receive proper instructions. This causes the individuals that are working with this individual that has inhibition challenges to describe them as spacey, as not being able to, keep a conversation without their eyes darting off into space. You might have noticed this with other people when you're possibly on a Zoom call or in a conversation where an individual that has inhibition challenges start to see their eyes wander. And it may not even be in the physical distraction. They can have any memory that pops up that they think it's funny and they'll just randomly laugh. And it's kind of weird. They're noted as unreliable because the lack of self-control leads them to not finish work on time. It leads them to not even show up to work at times. And sometimes it even leads to them not participating in work or relationships for long periods of time. If you've ever had an individual with inhibition in your life or you struggle with inhibition, one of the most common examples of this is not responding to text messages. At times, my clients and the parents that I work with tell me that, hey, my child doesn't respond to text messages and they don't respond to emails or anything like that. And guess what's actually happening is that they see the message and then they get distracted and they can't stop themselves from being distracted and they never actually get back to the message. And then they're noted as unreliable because they don't show up, they don't respond, they don't communicate. And this leads to the very last thing, is that it is actually very destructive for the relationships in their lives. And they're described as being destructive in the relationships to the individuals that don't actually understand the challenges that the individual with inhibition challenges are facing. They are destructive because the lack of self-control builds. It develops into self-sabotaging, victimizing, and low confidence and self-esteem. The lack of properly developing inhibition skills often leads to isolation, either forced by those around them or decided by the individual because they can't seem to keep a conversation, be reliable, and oftentimes because of all those factors, they're very destructive in those relationships. It's a very sad thing, but what I think is important is to talk about how the individuals that have these challenges actually perceive themselves and perceive the world that they're interacting with. So let's jump into that next section now. So how does it actually feel for the client or the individual that has inhibition challenges? So all the while, my clients that have poor inhibition skills describe seeing their destructive behavior in third person. They desperately want to show respect and be responsible by paying attention to instructions for school, work, or at home. But it is nearly impossible when voices of other coworkers in their conversations are grabbing their attention just as much. Or they're caught laughing in a conversation they shouldn't be laughing at, and they know this, but a funny thought just slipped into their minds and they just can't help it. Having poor inhibition skills for my clients is a very destructive aspect of their sense of worth and capability to do things. At times, my clients are able to exhibit good inhibition at the beginning of their day, and they notice that and they become super proud, super happy. However, their inhibitions begin to get worse and worse as the day progresses on, causing them to feel worse about themselves for the next couple of days. However, research has shown time and time again that if an individual with inhibition challenges is asked to do repeatedly inhibitory responses over and over again, their inhibition will naturally get worse and worse as the day progresses. And this kind of makes sense. If we're making the same action or we're doing the same action over and over again, we naturally get tired. Our brain naturally gets tired of it. And when my clients tell me that their inhibition is just getting worse and worse throughout the day, what we actually do is we examine the daily structures and come up with productive breaks. So let's actually go through an example of this.